Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Banter and Beans, and joining me is my co-host, Ben Kinsley. Ben's going to take you through Act 73, and that's about the funding changes to our favorite subject, education. So go ahead, Ben, take it away.
All right, Pat, grab your
I
grab your
got it.
coffee and
I got it.
we're going to talk about what's brewing in Vermont. All right, that's our tagline. So, there's actually a lot going on in Act 73. This is a bill we followed very closely here at Campaign for Vermont while it was making its way through the legislature. And today I think we're just going to focus on the funding aspects of Act 73, which are perhaps the least controversial or one of the least controversial parts of the law. So what Act 73 did is it created a new funding mechanism called the foundation formula, which the majority of states use, a foundation formula of some variety. The original House bill, and the way this works, all right, to back up, is the state sets a number that is the number of dollars every student in the state gets in the public education system. So, every school receives that number times the number of students that they have. So, if the number is say $10,000, just to make the math easy, and you have 100 students, you're going to get 10 times 100. So that's the funding from the state. Now, typically, what can happen is a local school district can choose to spend more than the state provides. That's usually how foundation formulas work. It's meant to be a floor that local districts can then spend above if they want to. That is tricky in Vermont because the Constitution requires that you have substantially equal access to educational opportunities. And folks who will remember the Brigham decision in the late 90s found that that basically means you need to have relatively equal funding. Like you can't have large disparities in funding. And today, there is a 300% difference between our lowest spending. It's actually a little more than that, but let's say call it 300% difference between our lowest spending districts and our highest spending districts on a cost per student basis. So the foundation formula is going to kind of wipe that away. And the original House version of the bill set that floor at 15,000, a little over $15,000 a student. Now, what happens is there's another set of formulas that goes through based on your demographics in your specific district. So 15,000 is not actually the check getting written to the school district. Um, they're also looking at what they call a bunch of weighting factors. And those weighting factors are things like how many kids you have in poverty, how many um, how many kids are on English language learner, like English language learning programs, non-English speakers, how many, how rural is your school, things like that. So those are the types of factors and those are some of those are still TBD, by the way. We have weighting factors in our current funding mechanism, which we've talked about in the past, and there's a lot of challenges with the current funding system. Won't get into all of them today, but that's a significant reason why we are seeing such drastic increases in our property taxes and education spending in general, is because of the way the current funding formula is structured. It incentivizes more spending, and there's not a direct link between what a local district is spending and what their tax rate is. So, for example, in the current framework, in the current funding formula, you can level fund your budget, and you could still see a double-digit increase in property taxes because of the what's going on at the statewide level. So if ever all the other districts in the state are increasing their spending, your property tax rate is impacted by that, as a local property taxpayer.
And that's very hard to explain to
Yes.
taxpayers and voters when I know one year Berlin just stood on its head to try to get education spending down, and we did an amazing job. And then we get the word from on high that our taxes are going up X%, and everybody just went berserk.
Yes.
It's just so hard to explain it to them. So
Yeah.
why bother? And their response was, why bother? Why bother saving money if we're going to get hit anyway?
And that's exactly why the current funding formula incentivizes more spending, because if you're not keeping up, if you're not increasing at the same rate that the statewide education spending is increasing at, then you're getting taxed more for less services, right?
Right.
So you're level funding, but your tax rate's still going up to 10%. Why not increase your spending 10% so
Well,
that
that's
you at
pretty
least
much
get a
what they
benefit?
said. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that's exactly what happens. That conversation plays out in all 120 school districts in the state. And that is why we see such dramatic increases in education spending, because of that dynamic right there. Um, and so the new funding formula, the foundation formula, fixes that. So it's no longer this tragedy of the commons situation. That's what we've used to describe that, race to the bottom in terms
Right.
of education spending, or perhaps it's a race to the top, because it's maybe a race to the top. So, that foundation formula fixes that in two different ways. One, it said the state says, all right, we're increasing the foundation formula the base amount at, you know, 5% or 3% or whatever the number is this year. And that is the starting point for everybody. Everybody's got the same starting point. It's not this like, oh, everyone's increasing at this rate, so I need to increase at 10% too in order to, like,
Right.
takes that off the table. The state says, here's the increase everyone's getting this year. Um,
Hmm.
so that is a much more top-down approach, but that is the way that most states do it. The other thing that it does, which makes it a lot more transparent, is it shows you where the problem is, right? So in the current funding formula, the local school boards blame the legislature blames the local school boards, and
Right.
most people can't sort out who's telling the truth or who's to blame. So in the foundation formula, it's going to be very clear where the problem is. So if, the legislature is increasing the base amount at 3%, but local spending is increasing at 10%, you know where the problem is, right? Same thing if, the legislature level funds and then local spending goes up by 5% to accommodate for the fact that the legislature level funded, where the problem is, right? So it makes it much more easy to explain. It makes it clear what's happening in the system and who's at fault for when property taxes are increasing in double digits. Um, the other thing that is important to note about that system is, I mentioned before those weighting factors. Those are going to really be important for what the impact to local school districts is going to be, and also the phase in. So we have, like I said, we have 300% difference between our lowest spending and our highest spending districts. This basically levels out everyone, and depending on the weighting factors a little bit, right? So the weighting factors are going to make everyone not quite equal, because the state is deeming that certain students cost more to educate, which is fair. But which students and how much is going to be the real question. So those weighting factors, which are yet to be developed, are going to be very important. Where the base amount actually gets set is going to be very important. Again, the House had 15,000, but the Senate pulled that out and said, we're going to study that. We're going to come back with a different set of recommendations on like what we think the right base amount and the weighting factors are going to be. So that's all very important to see what that actually means for local districts, right? Because we're going to push them all together. So the high spenders are going to have to come down, the low spenders are going to have to come up, but the question is going to be how much, and
Right.
the base amount and the weighting factors are really going to
Yeah,
determine
you
that.
said the weighting factors have yet to be developed. I thought, what was it, 2 years ago? We went through a whole session talking about weighted factors. Where are those? Out the
Yes.
window?
That is a great question. Yes, 2 years ago we went through and did a whole new set of weighting factors
Right.
for the existing funding formula. The legislature is throwing that all out, and they're
Ah,
redoing all of it in the context of the new foundation formula. And, one of the things that the existing weighting factors did not account for is staffing costs. So, for
Oh,
example,
interesting.
yeah, so it waited for things like special needs students and English language
Right.
learners and rurality and like all these different things, but it did not wait for specifically what costs the most in an education system. 80% of education costs are tied up in staffing salaries.
Ah,
And the thing that the foundation for that the or excuse me the previous weighting factors were not accounting for is geographic differences in the salary requirements. So
right.
like for example, a teacher in Chittenden County, cost of living is much higher. You've got to be
Right.
able to pay them more versus somewhere in like Rutland County perhaps, where cost of living is lower, and average salaries are lower. So that's something that perhaps the legislature should consider is taking into account differences in what staffing costs actually are.
I've always pushed market factor, which is a teacher in
Yeah.
Vermont gets paid $30,000. But if you work in Burlington, you get $35,000. I'm making this up totally, the number. But then if you take a job in Bristol, you lose that $5,000 because the market factor in Bristol is lower than. I just thought that was so much easier. It would be hard to take a cut. You'd think it's a cut if you move to a lower district, but that would be they'd understand it better.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like, we know that South Burlington, for example, has the highest teacher salaries in the state. Like we know that. And most of the Chittenden County school districts are pretty close behind them. So we need
Hmm.
to, like, this is a reality on the ground. Like staffing costs more in
Right,
urban areas because cost of living is higher, but we're not
right.
accounting for that. So I think that that's something we probably should be looking at. Um, so the other thing that is important to note in here, and because we're starting to run out of time, is so remember I said, and I've talked about this a couple times, the difference today between high and low spenders is over 300%. Um, so that means like a low spender, the high spenders are spending 3 times as much on a cost per student basis as the lowest spender. And the foundation formula is going to compress that range, which is a good thing. But it's going to be painful in the first couple of years because you're going to see dramatic cuts in some districts and you're going to see dramatic increases in other districts, both in spending but also in tax rate. So those are things to consider
So do
on
you
the
think the
implementation
market, oh,
front.
I'm sorry, Ben. Do you think the market factors that they will use will be similar to the ones that I actually liked what they did 2 years ago? It made a lot of sense to me. That'll fix me. Um, will it be similar to what they did 2 years ago, or is it we're looking at another whole new definition of
Of weighting
weighted
factors.
factors? Yeah,
I think it's going to be a whole new definition. I don't think there's going to be a ton. I mean, we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding, right?
right. Because
But
I commented a couple of times how much I liked it. It made so much sense to me. But there you go.
so an important thing to know, aside from the implementation, and we'll get to the implementation, come back to that in a second, but the legislature capped the amount of spending that a district can choose to spend above the foundation amount at 10%. So a local district can only spend 10% above their foundation formula allotment. And that is important because that means that we really have to get those weighting factors correct because the remedy at the local level, if a district feels like they don't have the resources to educate their kids at the rate that the state is providing, then additional local spending on top of the foundation amount is the recourse for that. And if you're only allowed to spend an extra 10%, that's not a lot of wiggle room. So that's important. And it's also a dramatic departure from what most other states do. Most other states allow
Oh, of
you
course.
either no cap or a very high cap. And so we're basically going from a system where there's a 300% variation in spending to a 10% variation in spending, more or less. And that's a significant shift. And there's going to be pain. And I think eventually what's going to happen is they're going to open that cap up. Um, the the legislature, at least one chairperson in the legislature thinks they're going to go the other direction and they're going to bring it down to zero. I don't think that's going to happen because I think the realities on the ground are going to force it to have some variation in spending. But
This is not going to be easy to explain this to
mm,
folks.
no, I
I,
think the end
it's going to
product
be
is going to be easy to explain. What's going to be hard to explain is it's going to be hard to explain to the districts that are high spending now that they have to come down, and the ones that are low spending that they're going to have to come up. That's going to be the difficult conversation. But it does fix the inherent structural problems in our current funding system where you have this race to the top mentality in terms of spending. And I will say another thing, this has been attached, these funding formula changes have been attached to the governance reform changes, which we'll talk about in a different show. But those are also in this bill, the governance reform changes, and they intentionally waited for better or worse to implement these funding formula changes, which could have gone into effect this year. They could have done that this year to change the funding formula, but they chose to wait and make the funding formula changes dependent on the governance changes, which means that this property tax relief is still years away. Like it's not going to happen today, tomorrow, or even 2 years from now. It's going to be several years down the road.
interesting. Well, I don't know how we're doing on time. We don't have much time, I don't think. My concern has always been the attorney said that Brigham all schools have to be substantially equal. They use those terms. Our legislature picked dollars as a way to make it
Yes.
level, but it could be a bunch of other things too. It could be everybody gets Latin, everybody gets math, and that could be substantially equal too. Why
Yeah.
did we pick money? Because it's not
Um,
working.
Yeah, I mean, I think an easy thing to look at is graduation standards, right?
There you
So
go.
like if we do not have universal graduation standards in Vermont, and so like every school district or every supervisory union designs their own graduation standards, which means we could have 60 to 120 different sets of
That's
criteria
I'm sorry,
for
that's wrong.
what it means to have a high school diploma. And
Yeah.
so if we really want to make sure that kids are getting the education they need, we should be looking at statewide
There
graduation
you go.
standards. And that gets to the equality question of like,
Yes,
are
I
kids
that
meeting?
would make sense to me, and especially now that there are changes in the federal oversight of education that they're going
Yeah,
to leave it up to the states. Well, I don't think if you go out to California and try to get a job and you should be able to say I went to the Vermont school system, and they should know what that means, not oh I went to Berlin. What does that mean?
yeah,
It should be one standard for the whole state. I like it.
agreed.
Let's push it.
All right. Well, I think we're out of time for today, Pat, but thanks so
Yep.
much. And, join us next time because we're going to keep
Yes.
talking about
Thank you.
the governance changes.
Yep. This conversation continues. Thanks, Ben. Good job.